Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. Once again, I'm your host, David Thompson. Today, it's my privilege to be joined by Brian Matthew Jordan, who is the recent author of Marching Home, Union Veterans and Their Unending Civil War, which is now out at press. So, Dr. Jordan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, Dave, thanks so much for having me. It's great to see you.
Now, I think it's really important. I think you bring up a really great point just right at the beginning of the book here, that this examination of Union veterans picks up really where a lot of other Civil War studies end, right? We get to Appomattox, the war is over, done and dusted, we're ready to move on unless somebody wants to tackle a little bit of Reconstruction, maybe a little bit of the assassination, but for the most part, a lot of Civil War studies end. But that's where you begin. So why don't you offer us a bit of a general overview of what this book really is about?
Well, Dave, it's a narrative history of Union veterans in the decades immediately after the war. And it's really a story about the men who won the war but couldn't bear the peace that followed. Veterans tended to a staggering litany of physical, psychological, and emotional scars, wounds that they believed provided, ready-made metaphors for kind of the unfinished nature of the war's work. They believed, to a remarkable degree, I think, that their military triumph on the battlefield had neither settled the war's central issues nor resolved the ultimate fate of the Union. This kept them agitated throughout those decades immediately after the conflict. And they returned home to a civilian population that wanted to move quickly beyond the painful issues of the war, that wanted to let bygones be bygones, that had bought into this reconciliation sentiment of how these veterans negotiate their own traumatic past in a society that has little room for them. It's a story of veterans who could never forget coming up against civilians who in many ways could never understand.
Now, what inspired you to tackle a project of this nature? It's not necessarily the first thing that might come to mind for a lot of individuals who are interested in the war.
Well, two things, I think. And I think the genesis of the project really goes back probably 15 years. When I was a young Civil War buff, I knew a man in my hometown of Akron, Ohio, named Gary Dillon, who had spent his own childhood crisscrossing the Midwest in search of some of the last survivors of Lincoln's armies. He actually met and interviewed some of the very last survivors of the Union armies. He had a lengthy correspondence and a personal relationship with Albert Wilson, who was the very last Union veteran, died in August of 1956 up in Duluth, Minnesota. And Gary would tell me stories about how he'd take the train from Akron up to Duluth and sit on Wilson's front porch and, watch him puff on fat cigars and tell war stories. And, that made the Civil War real and immediate for me. And I think I never really got over those stories. And there was one remark in particular. He said that these veterans had never really gotten over the war, even after so many decades. He said you could still get the sense that they had never really put 1861-65 behind them, and that comment stayed with me. And then I went off to graduate school and discovered that scholars really didn't know Union veterans. They were kind of caricatures. There was kind of a collective lament in the literature that, they didn't write about the war in the immediate post-war decades, that their diaries all kind of collectively stopped at Appomattox or at the Grand Review, that they'd slipped into this period of hibernation, and that Union veterans cause. They were, in some ways, villains in this literature. If you think about sectional reconciliation as this dark bargain that achieved national healing at the expense of racial justice. So the combination of that, sense that there was more to that historiography and those memories of Gary Dillon's stories kind of combined in a powerful way to bring me to the book.
Now, obviously, when you're tackling a project of this scope, sources become an issue. Both, obviously, you can't tackle everything. You can't incorporate everything. There's going to be material that you're going to come across, I'm sure, in the coming years that you wish you had known.
I already have, Dave.
But so, how do you, reconcile that? How do you decide on kind of when to stop? Obviously, you had to at some point, but what did you decide that you were going to, consciously look for? Were there certain things that you were avoiding, thinking that perhaps, memoirs, for instance, coming back, looking at the war, perhaps with rose-colored glasses, and that might not be and the immediate post-war period. So that may have been a source you might want to avoid. So how did you tackle that issue yourself?
I really, as you suggest, I really wanted to get onto the ground level experience of these veterans, and I wanted to get into their personal manuscripts and the things that they were writing at the most intimate level, not necessarily things that they were writing for commercial publication, most of which came, of course, much later in the 1880s and 1890s. So I visited every Northern State Historical Society and a number of local state historical societies, and I really hope, if anything else, that the book is a testament to the power of those archives. There's so many sources there that just have been untapped or have been maybe mined for the military content, but not necessarily for the post-war stuff. And that collective lament that I talked about earlier, that historians had said veterans really didn't reflect on the experience to any great extent in their personal writings, I found to be completely false, right? I found abundant manuscript material, memoirs that they labored over in the late 1860s and into the 1870s, reflecting on this experience, reflecting on the tensions of returning to civilian life. Of course, used a lot of veterans' newspapers, which flourished in that immediate post-war period. So I really wanted to get onto the ground level, which is what historians who have worked on this problem of the veterans' experience, and there are a number of them and a growing number of them, that's what they really hadn't done.
What surprised you as you started to make your way through this research?
I'll tell you, several things surprised me. The first is that I really set out, and when I entered graduate school, to write a dissertation that was going to challenge the reconciliationist paradigm. Right? I wanted to dismantle race and reunion, and it was the book that really got me really angry as an undergrad, Civil War era studies minor at Gettysburg College. Wanted to really take apart that book. And I wanted to say, there's, this reconciliation paradigm is fundamentally false. And when I got into the archives, what I found is that, white Northern civilians, to a staggering degree, I mean, even in the days before Lee surrendered Appomattox, are embracing this notion that, it's time to let bygones be bygones. Let's look toward the freewheeling bounty of the Gilded Age. And that really surprised me. And what I found was this tension that really animates the entire book between veterans and civilians, veterans who could never forget, civilians who could never understand. So that was a big surprise. The other surprise was the extent to which veterans were willing to concede themselves, and they were self-effacing about this, that, again, the war had not settled all the issues, that there was unfinished business. They believed that it was unfinished. Some of them believed Appomattox was halftime, and that was surprising to me. They, of course, were rather self-righteous. They believed that they had fought for a just and righteous cause, that this was a holy war. For some of them, they were on the right side of history, no doubt. But those sentiments did not, prevent them from also saying, look, we have to reap the fruits of victory. We have to figure out the major questions that this war has placed on the table now for the years of Reconstruction. What do we do with our defeated enemies? What do we do with the former slaves? Those were questions that they believed needed sorting out, and they believed, therefore, that reconciliation had to be something that was a lengthy process, that was measured, and that was thoughtful. Right? It's not that they were, anti-reconciliation. It's not that they were absolutely unwilling, certainly by the end of their lives, to embrace Johnny Reb. Right? It's that they wanted that embrace to be conscious of just what kind of rebellion this was. They wanted it to be mindful of the personal costs of the war to them and also its political results.
Now, I think a lot of us that look at the war, at times we can gloss over the fact that 1865, the summer of 65, post-Appomattox, post-Grand Review, witnesses a massive demobilization of the Army. You have all these men who need to go home. And I wonder, in kind of the immediate aftermath of the war, What are these men thinking as they make their way home, and how are they received by the northern civilian population kind of in that immediate aftermath?
So demobilization is something that is a lengthy process, and it's one that's jarring for them. Here they are, they're breathless coming out of the continuous campaigning of the war's final year, and now they suddenly find themselves, kind of marooned in a camp, awaiting discharge papers, and they have a lot of time to think. They feel a lot of different things. A lot of the emotions begin to well up in these camps as they await the discharge papers. They feel as though they want one more swat at the rebels. That is a common recurring theme throughout their writings. They, one more battle, they would finish them all off, and they would take no prisoners. Especially after Lincoln's assassination, and Martha Hode's recent book is very good on this. The other thing that they begin to think about, and they're very anxious about, and they're very candid about it, is they wonder if they are going to be able to return to civilian life with great ease. What will that look like? Will they be able to be good husbands and fathers once again? Will they be able to reestablish those pre-war relationships? And there's a lot of anxiety about that. They wonder how they're going to be welcomed home. Will they be seen as morally tainted by the experience of battle? They have those same fears. Nathaniel Hawthorne famously writes up in New England. He says that our rural villages are going to be spoiled and coarsened by the return of all of these men who have marched with Sherman and torched Columbia, and Northern civilians fear what 1.8 million demobilized soldiers will look like. This is a massive undertaking. Never before in American history will so many men be called veterans. And so there's this mutual distrust, mutual skepticism, I think, that will over time subside, but in that immediate post-war period creates this anxious atmosphere.
Now, you make it very clear in the book, and you've already alluded to it here in the interview, you're obviously pushing back a bit against some of the other historiography dealing with veterans, particularly Gerald Linderman, who talks about some of the hibernation, and that's the phrase
Right.
that he uses, and you've mentioned it here, of Union veterans in the immediate post-war period. I wonder, and you've alluded to it already, but if you could just elaborate a little bit more on what kind of concrete steps are Union veterans taking in the war's aftermath to make sure that this war is remaining prominent, I guess, in Northern society and Northern thinking.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the important interventions that I hope the book makes is that I hope we begin to move the kind of the memory conversations out of the realm of cultural representation and into the idea that memory is also lived experience. Right, Civil War memory does not merely manifest itself in monuments on town greens or in memoirs in libraries. Civil War memory happens whenever a veteran leans into a crutch or guzzles a bottle of rum or begs for spare change. And so one of the arguments here is that veterans kind of, in spite of themselves, become reminders of the war every time that they're seen in public. And they're seen in public a lot because there are so many of them. They're publishing their own newspapers. They feel that they have a sense of authority over Reconstruction and the issues of the war. In spite of kind of the classical small R Republican citizen soldier's obligation to return home and demand no reward and slip inconspicuously back into civilian life, they believe that they have an obligation, right, to keep these issues alive, and they do that through editorializing, through their own organizations. The Grand Army of the Republic will get started in April of '66. And other kindred organizations, survivor guilds from ex-prisoner of war associations, they all come together and they make a collective demand and really articulate a nascent ideology of veterans' rights that again seeks recognition but also demands that civilians look back and think about this war.
Now, obviously, one of the battles, particularly political battle, in the post-war period, deals with pensions for veterans. It becomes a huge part, I think that's probably an understatement, of the federal budget as the 19th century progresses. People would be astonished, I think, if they broke it down and looked at it.
Right.
you obviously have, but if other individuals took a look at it and really wrap their head around it, it's simply mind-boggling, frankly. So I wondered, what of the pension battles as the 19th century progresses for Union veterans, and how in examining that battle, or battles rather, do we see further contestation by Union veterans in an effort to assert a role in Northern society in the post-war period?
Well, I think that too often we've seen the pension battles as kind of a symptom of Gilded Age fiscal conservatism, right? And that it's a Gilded Age issue. And here, what I want to do is show that it's a part of a much longer history of negotiating veterans' rights between veterans and civilians. And what I think is really amazing in the pension battle is the degree to which veterans are articulating this nascent, novel ideology of veterans' rights. This is, something that's completely new in veterans' history in the 1870s and 1880s. I mean, the veterans that Northern civilians expect to come home are the American Revolution veterans and the War of 1812 veterans, who were, again, the classical small R Republican citizen soldiers that demanded no reward, right? Here you have the beginning of this notion that military service has opened a contract, right, between the veteran and his government, and that the people have an obligation to care for him who had borne the battle, as Lincoln says in the second inaugural address. And they press that issue until pensions are gradually and painstakingly liberalized over the course of that late 19th century. It's not until 1890 in Benjamin Harrison's administration that you have what's known as the Dependent Pension Act, which basically provides a blanket old age retirement pension for all Union ex-soldiers. But it's a long process, and again, it's a portal into this tense struggle between civilians who wanted to move on and veterans who were oriented back toward the war.
And finally, Dr. Jordan, I'll leave you on this question. Certainly, veterans' issues are very much at the forefront of society today with the recent VA scandal, and we have tens of thousands of veterans coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. So I wondered, what lessons can we perhaps glean from looking at the experience of the Union veterans and their efforts in the political situation surrounding that, more than 100 years ago, and what can we carry forward to today and try to apply to our current situation?
Well, I argue in the book that the federal government after the Civil War was ideologically and infrastructurally ill-equipped to deal with the problem of the returning veteran, which I think complicates in some important ways this notion that some historians have that this larger centralized federal government emerged from the battlefields of the Civil War. Here's an example of the first major social problem that confronts us as a nation after the war, the problem of disabled veterans. Where's the federal government? They are, unable to deal effectively with the problem. I think ideologically, certainly, and maybe infrastructurally, we've advanced on that question. We now, of course, have a Veterans Administration, a cabinet level post, a Secretary of Veterans Affairs, which, of course, Bill Yank didn't enjoy. So that's made it somewhat easier. But what I think we still haven't done as a nation, and this is what I think Bill Yank was asking most directly and sincerely for, we still haven't figured out a way to have a national ritual of reintegration. We haven't figured out how to have a national conversation that recognizes and acknowledges the truth of the veterans' experience. Billy Yank wanted to share his horrific war stories with a wide audience. He wanted them to be accepted, and he wanted his opinion on the matter to count. And that didn't happen. There was little room for Billy Yank in the late 19th century either to share those horrific war stories or to maintain his radicalized views on the war. Today, I would argue that Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, we still don't have a forum as a nation for them to come back and to speak to us with their relentless candor about what war really is about. what the experience of war is about, and what they think the road ahead looks like. Because we see on the news every day, right, that wars do not end when the shooting stops, and we're living in a post-war period right now that is not unlike the one that Billy Yank returned to, one that is riddled with questions and not very many answers.
Well, Dr. Jordan, thank you so much for taking some time to speak with us today. Again, everyone, the book Marching Home, Union Veterans and Their Unending Civil War, published by Liverite, which is a division of W.W. Norton. It's now out. I really recommend that you pick it up. Beautifully written, which is not surprising for Dr. Jordan here. He's a great writer, also a great teacher. I neglected to mention at the beginning, a lecturer in Civil War era studies at Gettysburg College. And I think it will offer really a different perspective for so many of us, particularly of Union veterans, in this period where, once the guns fall silent in Appomattox, a lot of us tend to think, Reconstruction happens, and that's largely a Southern issue in the sense that that's where the violence is, and that's where most of the problems, quote unquote, are. But I think looking at this book shed some new light for so many people on the fact that, for Northern veterans, the war was only the beginning of a struggle that they carried with them to their graves. So thank you so much for coming on, Dr. Jordan, and perhaps we can have you on again in the future to discuss the next book.
All right, thanks so much, Dave, and hope to see you soon.